Me and my wife rented our first house back in 2012. There was nothing creepy or particularly off-putting about it, just a standard terraced house on a street of identical houses in the northern town in England. My wife was pregnant at the time, so we needed somewhere to bring up our first child. We chose this one as it was an area we were both familiar with, and rent was affordable. When we first moved in, everything was normal, just a standard house, and we set about getting furnishings and all the usual stuff. I used to take my wife to work in the early morning. I'd drop her off and come back home. The front door opened directly into the living room, and there was a sliding door from this room which went into the kitchen. This had a door going out to the back to an enclosed yard shared with nearby houses and the stairs leading upstairs. There was also a frosted glass window next to the sliding door which was presumably once used as a serving hatch, but now just served to let some natural light in, as the sun never got to the front of the house due to the narrow street and the surrounding houses. Within a few weeks of moving in, I developed a weird feeling, like something was watching me through the window. It wasn't overpowering by any means, but it did get to the point whereby I'd actively avoid looking at it out of the corner of my eye, as some part of me always worried I might see something on the other side looking back at me. I'd always been deeply skeptical of anything paranormal, so always tried to ignore it or laugh it off as me just being stupid in an unfamiliar house. That said, the feeling became stronger to the point that after dropping my wife off at work, I'd come home and catch a few hours on the sofa in the living room as I didn't want to go into the kitchen and up the stairs to bed. The feeling was definitely strongest in the kitchen and on the stairs, and the only way I can describe it is, it felt like it was predatory, like the constant nagging feeling that something was either watching you or right over your shoulder about to rush you, even though there was nothing there that could be seen by the naked eye. Things seriously escalated after one particular evening. We were watching a Darren Brown TV show, whereby he was disproving the idea of paranormal and seances. Part of the show actually asked you to perform a Ouija board at home, and the premise was that he would lead the responses and tell you what the results would be that you were going to get, thereby removing any idea of it being anything more than suggestion and a parlor trick. My skeptical nature, combined with my wife's belief in the paranormal, meant that I was keen to go along with this, just to prove her how silly her beliefs were. We started the Ouija board and went along with all the instructions, except we didn't get the results that the show said we would. We got something far more sinister. When we asked the name of the spirit, rather than the scripted name we were supposed to get, we got the name Ernest. By this point, I'm laughing, thinking my wife is pranking me and that Ernest was a stupid name to come up with. My wife isn't laughing though, and says we should stop. Thinking it's all her, I go along with it though. Do you like us living here, Ernest? The Ouija board went to no. Why not, Ernest? What do you think of me? The Ouija board spelled out the word rogue. Now, it's worth mentioning that this confused me. My only experience with the word rogue was as various classes in video games. Okay, well, what do you think of my wife? The Ouija board actually spelled out the word whore. Now, at this point, my wife is getting more upset by the moment, and she's really quite distressed. We follow the rules and say goodbye. The glass we were using as a planchette goes to goodbye. The board we were using was actually made out of scraps of paper with letters and numbers and the usual yes, no, hello, and goodbye on them. As my wife was so freaked out by this, I collected them together, put them in a glass bowl, and took them out to the yard and burned them. Partly for her peace of mind, partly for my own. I have to admit, it was kind of creepy. Around 20 minutes or so after we went to bed that night, we heard this loud bang that came from downstairs. I went downstairs to check on everything, thinking something may have fallen over, but everything was still in place, so I went back to bed, confused but not creeped out. As we lived in a terrace house, I told my wife it might just be the neighbors banging the cupboard door, and then we went to sleep. The next night after we went to bed, within the first half hour of being in bed, the exact same bang happened downstairs. And this happened every night, no matter what time we went to bed. Whether it was 9 p.m. or 1 a.m., within half an hour, we heard the exact same bang. Always at least once, sometimes maybe twice. We tried to replicate the noise, and after trying everything, we discovered that a heavy cupboard door in the corner of the kitchen, when opened then let go, made the exact same noise. I have to admit, I was pretty intrigued and keen to find out what this was, as we'd never had any signs of pests or vermin, and the cupboard was fixed to the wall about 6 feet off the ground. So I asked my wife to let me set up a camera in the kitchen so we could record it after we went to bed. Unfortunately, she wouldn't though, as she said she either didn't want to know or didn't want to antagonize it if it was anything supernatural. Things really began to go downhill from there. We'd find ourselves arguing over the smallest thing, having full-blown shouting arguments for hours over nothing. Despite normally being very chilled out, I was often accused of being too laid back even. I found myself constantly on edge, in a combination of what I can only describe as anger and anxiety. This didn't happen overnight, and was something that built up slowly, with both of us, to the point I didn't notice it was happening until much later. There was no waking up a different person moment, but a slow and subtle change. Despite it never happening before, I began suffering from nightmares on a regular basis. I would have vivid dreams of family members dying in horrific ways, like being burned alive. I'd wake up screaming or in tears, and my wife would have to spend an hour reassuring me they weren't real and calming me down. The most disturbing thing, though, was when she told me that she would constantly toss and turn due to being heavily pregnant, and when she'd look over at me, I would just be laying there with my eyes wide open, staring blankly, like I was asleep, but with my eyes open, and when she told me to close them, I would, with no other reaction or comment. I have absolutely no recollection of ever doing this, and have never done this at any point before, or since living in that place. The arguments continued, and got worse. The regular bang at night continued, and the all-over sense that something was following me, particularly in the kitchen and the stairwell, became more and more overpowering, despite my best efforts to convince myself that I was being ridiculous, and trying to make myself walk slowly up the stairs. I was clearing that flight of stairs 3 steps at a time, and I was filled with adrenaline and my heart pounding inside my ears. There was a brief lull in activity in the month or so before our child was born. It was around Christmas, and the arguments had abated, and we seemed to get back to ourselves. I thought we'd turned a corner. The nightly bang persisted, but we'd become so used to it at that point that now we would just look at each other and roll our eyes. My wife told me that the kitchen and the living room window, and the sense of being watched or followed, was something that she experienced too. Then, our little boy was born, and everything was okay for the first week or so, but the atmosphere soon began to change. That sense of anger and anxiety began to creep back in, and we were starting to bicker again. The atmosphere was made worse as our newborn baby would just cry constantly, every hour of the day that he was in that house. He'd only sleep for 20-minute intervals, and the rest of the time would be spent trying to nurse, wind, feed, distract, play, anything to try and soothe him, but nothing worked. We had him back and forth to the hospitals, and so many times in the first few months the doctors looked at us like we were crazy, because every time we would get there, he was calm and sleeping, or gurgling happily. I was beginning to think I was cracking up myself, but when we got home, the crying would begin again. We ended up taking turns to see him at night, but this wasn't helped by the fact that I now apparently was doing that weird sleeping with my eyes open thing again. I think it culminated for me one night when I was laid in bed, waiting for the inevitable cry to start, when I saw a shadow form in the corner nearest the window and began to slowly move across the fitted wardrobes that we had in the room. I initially thought it was being created by the curtains against the headlights of a car moving slowly down the road or something, but it wasn't moving right. The best comparison I can make is that of ink dropped into water. The room was dark, so we could try and help the boy sleep, but this was darker than the rest of the room, like a very rich black, and seemed to have shapes like smoky tendrils or something coming off of it. I laid and watched as it inched along the cupboards, and then watched it go around a corner and continue on the wall. I knew at this point it wasn't a shadow, as a shadow would have just jumped from the wardrobe to the wall, not creep around the corner that was facing in the opposite direction to the window. I watched it go out of the door and onto the stairs. If this sort of happened to me at this point in my life, now I would have noped straight out of the room. But at the time, I remember being oddly mesmerized by it, and only started to feel any kind of fear after it left the room. I resolved not to tell my wife, just because we'd already experienced enough weirdness to be on edge, and the idea that I may have just seen a manifestation would probably upset her even more. It was winter at this point, and the house was constantly cold, not helped by how dark it was due to the sunlight being unable to make its way in. No matter what we tried, we couldn't get the place to maintain a constant, comfortable temperature. One room may be red hot, but the next it would be freezing, despite the heating being set to the same throughout the house. The rooms that experienced hot or cold varied from hour to hour. The temperature would spike in a room only to fall again to an uncomfortably cold in the space of half an hour. We had a room thermometer for our baby, and we were having to constantly move from room to room to try and find one that was relatively normal that we could keep him in. Unfortunately, I found the one place in the house where the temperature remained the most stable were the stairs and the landing. So I'd find myself having to sit there, fighting that rising anxiety to run, because it was the one place where our child could either not be overheating or wrapped in blankets against the cold. Around this time, I remember a dream quite clearly where I was talking to a woman. No idea who she was, and she was saying how dark and cold the house was. She asked me if I knew what that meant. I said not. I remember even now when she said that life needs light to grow. The only thing that can thrive in darkness is death. It may have been my overactive paranoia or subconscious, but I clearly remember waking up with those words still in my head. Now, when I hear a lot of these stories, I often wonder why people didn't just get out. There's usually excuses about not wanting to surrender their home and fighting for their house. Well, this wasn't our house. We were just renting it, and all the combined problems and weirdness just got to be too much. We decided we had to move. We found a house a few miles away and gave our notice on the place. It was the night before we were due to move. In the early hours of the morning, we heard a piercing siren. We had a carbon monoxide alarm, and it was going off. We opened all the doors and windows and got outside. My wife and our boy went to my parents while I waited for the gas engineer. He arrived and immediately condemned the gas fire we had in the living room, which had started leaking carbon monoxide. It's difficult not to think that without that alarm, we could have all been dead. And the fact it happened on the day we were due to leave? I couldn't shake the idea that the two were linked, and something either wanted us not to leave, or to give us one final parting gift. I'd like to say we moved and everything was better overnight, but it wasn't. The new house started out okay, but that nagging feeling of being followed around slowly crept back. Not as intense, but noticeably there. In this house, we all shared a bedroom and had a lot of stuff still packed in boxes and generally cluttered in a spare room. One of them was a bouncer for our baby. This was one of those Fisher-Price frog-type bouncers and had eyes on the front, which, when rolled, would play a tune. Well, one night around 4 a.m., the frog tune starts going off. I immediately looked at the crib next to our bed, thinking our baby might have gotten out somehow and started playing with it, but he was fast asleep. I did everything I could to get it to go off again without spinning the eyes. I tried knocking on it, hitting it on the floor. Nothing. I tried to tell myself that it was maybe just the batteries, but this was the only time it ever happened, and we didn't have to change the batteries for the next 2 years or so that we had it. The feeling of being watched grew, only now it was strongest from a conservatory on the back of the property. My wife and I had been through enough by this point, and we were now openly discussing the weird feelings with each other. There were a set of double doors between the kitchen and the conservatory, and this one particular night, my wife asked that I close them. I didn't ask why, I just did so. About an hour or so later, I decided to go back out there for a smoke. As I opened the doors, the glass-paneled French doors of the conservatory were in front of me. It was dark outside, so all I could see in the doors was the reflection of the lit kitchen behind me. As I walked towards the doors to see the reflection, I very clearly see a black silhouette of a person run behind me, almost like it ran into the house through the exterior wall and straight through under the stairs. My first thought was someone was outside, but as I checked, no one was there. So So I just stood there smoking and thinking about it, and I realized something. It couldn't have been outside, as the figure passed behind me and was briefly obscured by my own reflection, so it had to have been in the room behind me. I quickly finished my cigarette and go back inside, and then I sat there, mulling it over before telling my wife the next day. To which she said she wanted the door shut as she hadn't felt comfortable about that room all day, more so than normal. We had a similar instance a month or so later, which could have ended badly. Whilst driving and pulling onto the motorway slip road, my wife all of a sudden jumped on the brakes. When I asked what the hell she was doing, she said a dark figure had just run out in front of the car. There was literally no one around, as the slip road was in a wooded area away from any built-up spots or paths. I didn't see this myself, as I was in the back of the car with our boy, but my mother-in-law was in the front, and she said she saw it too, and was equally as spooked as my wife. Gradually since then, the feelings of anxiety and tension subsided, and we eventually moved again. Mirroring our experience of leaving the last place though, on the day we were moving, we were taking our belongings down to the drive to a van when a roof tile slid off and narrowly missed hitting me or my brother-in-law in the head. We moved to a house which, out of any, should have been the most haunted, having been built earlier than the others in the 1830s. This house, however, was the most tranquil and had no such weird atmosphere or happenings. All of this started 8 years ago and finally ended 6 years ago. We often walk past the first house and have seen it come up for rent many times since then, so nobody really seems to stay there long. I can't help but think that they're experiencing the same things that we did. The funny thing is, we've both said a few times how when we see it on the market, we both have a desire to go back. We've even talked about going in for a fake viewing, just to walk around the place. We never have though, but even the idea that after everything we still feel an urge to go back is something to which the rational part of my brain just can't really explain. I'm so tempted to go back through all the old census records to see if an Ernest ever lived there, but so far I've resisted the temptation to rake it all over for fear of setting something off again. That, along with the idea of finding out that somebody named Ernest really did live there and kind of communicated with us on a Ouija board, well, I don't know if I would really like the answer to that.